cover it fairly rapidly because I know you're a smart audience and know a lot of you are familiar with the concepts, and I'll have plenty of time to elaborate with graduate students I know at a later period of time. I did give this talk very recently at China, and it turned out that most of the people had minimal comprehension of English. I really had to slow down, and it was very tough to speak slowly. So I'm now going to go back at my natural pace. So this is the lumberjack talk, and it's really fitting that I'm giving it here at George Mason because it is a tribute to Roger Parasurman, friend and colleague. And I realized I put this talk together quite a while ago before I came here, but I realized before I came here that I focused on three things that were very much part of Raj's research life: complacency, stages and levels, and also the human factors of air traffic control. And all three of those things will be themes throughout the talk. So what I'm going to do today is going to spend a little time talking about the background of imperfect automation and its relation to situation awareness, automation transparency. Then I'll talk about an experiment involving a robotic arm. I will talk about a computational model of automation complacency and eye movements that we developed for that particular experiment. And then a second experiment on imperfect air traffic control conflict resolution aids. So two experiments, a model, and all put against the context of this background of analogy. So the lumberjack analogy is in the simple form, automation helps when it's correct, that is when the tree stands, but it hurts when it fails, when the automation fails, the tree falls. And there are really 5 layers of argument in this lumberjack analogy that I'll present first before talking about the 2 experiments. The first is that automation helps. If it didn't help, we wouldn't use it. Simple as that. Secondly, that automation can fail. By the way, I'm going to unpack each of these layers in the subsequent slides. 3, when automation fails, the human may show a poor response in failure management. 4, the higher the degree of automation, the greater the benefits when automation performs correctly, so the higher the tree, but also the greater the problems when automation fails. And then finally, the 5th layer of argument is these greater problems, the higher tree falling harder, can be mitigated by transparency, which supports situation awareness. So let's go through at least the first 2 of these points fairly rapidly. Automation provides a benefit of reducing workload and increasing performance, increasing safety and productivity. Typically 1, usually 2, sometimes all 4 of those things happen with adaptation of automation. But secondly is the idea that automation can fail. Despite claims to the contrary by the designers that create the automation, this is perfect, it'll never fail, it always does. The software hardware failure, or software bug, or the calculator battery fails in the middle of the final exam where you're using the calculator. Sometimes it fails to act in ways expected by the human who has a mental model of the process and logic. And there's been a lot of research on that, particularly in the flight deck, that pilots don't understand the kinds of actions that automation is trying to do, and therefore pilots think the automation has failed. And we consider that a failure from a functional point of view. Or sometimes it's asked to do tasks beyond its capabilities. And we give the example of the Air China near crash. It was flying over the Pacific at about 40,000 feet. The right engine failed, and so there was an asymmetric thrust, but the autopilot kept up with the failure and compensated for a while until it could compensate no more, and then suddenly, catastrophically, the plane went into a barrel roll, fell about 37,000 feet, or 30,000 feet before recovering 4,000 feet above the water. Quite a ride for the passengers. And that was the case, I just sort of say, where the autopilot, the automation, was trying to do its job, but simply the asymmetry was so great that it just wasn't designed to accomplish. So the third element of the argument is that when automation fails, the humans sometimes cannot deal with the failure. can't cope with it. And this can create sometimes disasters in safety critical systems. And these disasters may even sometimes offset the benefits when automation works correctly. Most people are probably familiar with the 3 Mile Island disaster, nuclear power disaster up in Tennessee, up in Pennsylvania, when the automation failed and the operators on board on duty had the wrong mental model. They thought the performance or the pressure, was getting too high when in fact it was getting too low. They shut off the safety. They did not cope in the meltdown. The 2008 financial crash is oftentimes attributed to humans not understanding the complex derivatives, the automated trading algorithms that were implemented, and simply intervening in part incorrectly. Started to go crazy. And coming back to aviation, certainly one of my favorite areas, in 2013, Asiana Airlines had a crash approaching San Francisco International Airport. What happened there? The pilots set a mode on the flight management system, the cockpit automation system, and they didn't realize that when they gave the automation control for one aspect of the flying, the mode turned off the autopilot, which thereby gave the pilot responsible for controlling the speed. The pilot didn't think they had responsibility, they didn't understand, and therefore the speed bled off, the plane came in low and slow and crashed short of the runway. So this was a failure of automation to do as expected. So all of these and many, many more provide examples of how humans fail to cope with automation failures. But now we start asking the psychological question of why does this happen? And so we zoom into the psychology of the operator in human automation interaction. And to do so, we identify this concept of Utluf. Sounds like an Icelandic volcano, but it's the notion of out-of-the-loop unfamiliarity. And by the way, I should give a lot of credit to Debbie Davis. Debbie's not here, is she, today? No. But certainly for doing a lot of the pioneering work in this area in flight deck automation. Okay, so Utluf is the poor human response when automation unexpectedly fails, and it results from breakdowns in 3 prominent aspects of human information processing. First of all, noticing that something is wrong. The psychology of change blindness, usually the initial automation failure is signaled by some change in the visual world, but we don't expect it to happen. Where complacency, we've stopped monitoring the system as carefully as we should, and so we have a failure to monitor an otherwise reliable system. The China Airlines barrel roll over the Pacific is an example where the pilots simply stopped monitoring the engine indicators on that right engine that showed that it was losing thrust. And clearly when we talk about complacency, as many of us know, this is where we really give a tribute to Raja, his early work at identifying the complacency phenomena and its relationships to eye movements. Component of Utluf is a failure to understand what is wrong with the automation. You may have noticed something's happened, but you don't understand what has wrong. And this is the loss of situation awareness of the state of the system. It leads to either a delayed or an incorrect response. We talked about the 3 Mile Island, where the operators thought that the pressure was too high when in fact it was exactly too low, and they made the opposite response to what they should have done. Well, this results from the fact that the human is no longer making active responses. It's called the generation effect, the idea that when you're generating an action yourself, you have a better understanding and better memory for the consequences of that action than if you're just witnessing or perceiving another agent making that same action. And also it results because much automation lacks transparency, that is, it lacks a good visual display of what the automation is doing and why, and the raw data that automation is processing. And that will be a focus of the second experiment I'm talking about today. The third component of OOTLOOP is this idea of de-skilling. You've used automation for so long that the manual or cognitive skills it replaced have degraded. And that's why clearly the FAA likes to pilots every so often to actually hand fly the aircraft, even though most of the time it's flown under high levels of automation. Coming back to our calculator, you forget how to do long division fluently when your calculator battery fails in the middle of the exam. And now suddenly you have to do this and do this, and divide and subtract, and all these procedures that we forgot how to do. Okay, so collectively, these define the poor human response to the automation failure, or what we call the failure response. But it turns out that this failure response is particularly pronounced the first time automation failures. And we call this the first failure just because the failure is totally unexpected. And graphically, we represent humans experiencing automation for a number of trials in the laboratory or operations in the real world. It fails the first time, we have a very poor response. Subsequent failures of automation still create a problematic response, but they're usually not as bad. And so we have argued repeatedly that to study human automation interaction, you really need to pay particular attention, even though it may fail repeatedly over several trials. And here's our graph again. But the challenge is, can we fix the automation failure response without reducing the automation benefits? After all, if there's a perfect trade-off, and the more you fix the failure response, the more you reduce the benefits, you really haven't gained anything. But can we get some sort of free lunch and figure out how to fix the human response to the failure without reducing the benefits? And I think I'll argue later that's what transparency seems to be about. The fourth level of our argument is related to this concept I call the degree of automation, that which makes the tree higher and fall harder. And our recent approaches to automation have been characterized by the stages and levels taxonomy. And again, we owe a lot to Raja on this. Raja and Tom Sheridan and I all worked on a task force for the FAA looking at air traffic control automation. Out of that task force, we developed the taxonomy, and then Raja had the wisdom to say, let's make a publication out of this. So we wrote it up for IEEE SMC, and I think it's got a fair amount of traction in terms of a good way of defining what automation does to support human performance. The original taxonomy has got 4 stages of human information processing that are assisted by automation: integration, response selection, response execution. But for the purposes today, I'm going to separate or simplify this into the 2 most important stages. And that is, automation can help humans make a situation assessment of what's going on, and they can also help guide decision in action. What do we do? And there's so many domains in which we can simplify human information processing into these 2 very fundamental and very different, both physiologically but also cognitively, stages of processing. Now, those are the stage dimension. The levels dimension is that at each stage, designers can vary the level of automation, which is really how aggressively or autonomously does automation serve at each stage. How much cognitive and motor work does automation replace and therefore relieve the burdens on human cognition? And so I've simplified this now in terms of this 2x2 matrix, where across the top are the 2 stages of automation: situation assessment and decision aiding, and on the 2 rows are the low and high levels. And we can give some examples. So a high level of situation assessment is when automation makes a firm, confident diagnosis of what's happening. Your engine is overheated. At a lower level, the automation maybe suggests 2 possible diagnoses. Either the engine is overheating or there's a blocked pressure valve. By making this uncertain diagnosis, we're now giving more responsibility, but also more cognitive work to the human operator. In terms of a decision aiding, it can make a single decision and possibly execute it. So the traffic system and the aircraft can just simply tell the pilot climb to avoid collision, or actually maybe implement the climb. Or it can offer possible courses of action. It can either climb, and the automation can say either climb or turn left to avoid a conflict. So if we take this 2x2 table, we can define within this the degree of automation is anything that moves from the lower left to the upper right. You know, this way, both ways at once. That's what we call a higher degree of automation. More automation authority, less human authority, and yes, human cognitive effort. And so we talk about the degree of automation, the higher tree, as moving from the lower left to the upper right on that vector. That makes sense? All right, let's take this vector, fold it down, make it the x-axis, low and high degree of automation. And you can realize, if you want to, that there are actually several levels along this vector. We can create as many as 12. And then we plot on the y-axis performance. And we can either plot normal performance when automation is working well, things get better, or performance under conditions of failure. When automation fails, there is a greater cost to performance. Fails. So this is the lumberjack analogy, the higher degree of automation, the later stage and or higher level, the higher the tree, and the harder it falls, the greater the hurt when it fails, particularly on the first failure. Okay, pretty simple relationship, pretty simple interaction here, but it's very fundamental, and I just want to make sure everybody sort of grounds the rest of the presentation in understanding this graph. Which is, here's our woodland analogy. And again, here is sort of the prototypical graph that presents these predictions. Okay, a little bit about where the graph came from. Raja and Tom Sharon and I had the notion, we looked at a few experiments that seemed to support this concept when we wrote the paper back in considerably later. Dietrich Manzi and Linda Onash and colleagues in Germany and I got together. We actually did a meta-analysis of all the studies we could find at that time that had varied the degree of automation along the x-axis, had measured performance when automation worked well on the left graph, and performance when automation failed on the right. We did a regression analysis of the meta-analysis data, and we found a significant upward curve on the left side, a significant downward curve on the right side. Okay. So there are data to support the lumberjack analogy. And then we looked at what underlies the increased cost at the higher degrees of automation when automation fails. And here's where intuition told us, but we look for the data to support the idea that it's a loss of level 2 situation awareness. That is understanding what is going on within the automated system. And so in the meta-analysis, we also included every study that had also looked at some measure of situation awareness as a function of the degree of automation. And the slope on that was downwards, statistically downwards. Not a huge effect, but nevertheless one that suggested it's the loss of situation awareness that underlay the loss in performance when automation failed. But as I say, the loss of situation effect was weak, although it was significant. And just because two variables correlate doesn't necessarily imply there's causality. And so that's part of what our experiments are about. But this leads to also the fifth step in my arguments on the lumberjack analogy. And that's the idea that transparency of the human automation interface should support situation awareness and therefore can buffer response, can make that tree fall a little more slowly and with a little less disaster. And there are a lot of concepts of transparency floating around the universe these days. I like to think of it as a graphic or text-based explanation of what automation is doing and why, often involving a clear, intuitive depiction of the input to automation, that is, the raw data that automation is processing. And in the second experiment, I'm going to talk about our explicit effort to impose transparency and buffer the fall of the higher tree. Okay, so this really comes down to addressing the trade-off through situation awareness support. And one of the ways we can reduce the trade-off is to simply reduce the degree of automation and simply not use higher degree automation. But the other, and this is what we really hope to do, is being able to say this is our failure situation, but with transparency we can pull that upward so there's no cost but a benefit to higher degrees of automation. So let's move from the background into the first of the two experiments. And this was operating robotics at 2 degrees of automation. We did this under sponsorship of NASA Johnson in collaboration with Nadine Sarter and her crew at the University of Michigan. The robotic arm task is one in which the operator had 6 degrees of freedom with 2 hand controllers to essentially have the robotic arm grab an object, move it up, across an obstacle, and downward. It turns out to be an extremely difficult task involving the spatial integration of 3 different camera views. Astronauts require as much as 40 hours of training on this to become proficient. In Michigan, we developed a simplified but realistic simulation for which our subjects took about 5 hours of training, much more than, say, the typical experiment. Interestingly enough, when I was first preparing this in my office in Boulder, I was sitting down below, slightly grabbing at the big windows, and all of a sudden I looked up the window. I saw. I couldn't believe the timing with this big robotic arm grabbing trees and hauling them off the ground. I almost thank you. Every so often the planets align. Right? More detail about the actual task itself. In the robotics arm simulation that we developed, based on the NASA, actually it was really the NASA simulation called Boris. Here's the camera used to the workstation. Lines, or what looks like a staple, is a representation of the trajectory that the operators were supposed to move the arm along. And you can see there are different camera views of it. This is a depiction of the workspace showing from a top-down view where the cameras are looking. This is on the left is a graphical user interface with which operators can control the speed of the arm and other properties. More schematically, here's our operator on the right with the 2 3-degree of freedom joysticks. That's the quadratic representation of the 4 views on the right side, the GUI on the left side. And in this particular task, we defined or created conditions with 3 different degrees of automation. One was entirely manual, in which they did all the controlling themselves. The second, or the lower degree of automation, we called situation awareness support. And in this degree of automation, operators could see this orange line target trajectory, giving them good situation awareness of how close they were to the ideal state in moving the arm. Wasn't doing any of the actions for the operator, but it was supporting their perception and understanding of where the arm was relative to the target in 3D space. The highest degree of automation, I call it DOA2, is decision and action support. And here, the operator had a full autopilot that actually flew the arm through its trajectory. Operators could keep their hands on the controls, but in general, the controls had no active effect on the arm unless something went wrong. These were 3 different groups of participants, but all 3 groups had been trained initially in the full manual condition. So they all had an understanding of how to do the task. Our prediction here was the automation and the higher degree of automation support progressively better routine performance, reduced error in following the trajectory, and faster mission time. All right, so this is the basic fundamental. Automation is good when it works well. We also wanted to induce and measure automation-induced complacency in our experiment. And so our participants had first several hours of practice with perfect automation, but they were always given the perfect XYZ coordinates of where to make these turns, right? Because that's critical. And as I say, everybody had a fairly good amount of manual training preceding the assignment into the conditions. Then each group got assigned to a little bit of training on their specific conditions, whether it's full manual situation awareness support or autopilot control. And then they did 7 experimental trials, each trial lasting about 5 minutes, something like that, but repeatedly going up. Automation helped during that time, increasing workload and precision. And then on trial 7, we imposed the failure, this characteristic of any examination of imperfect automation. Our prediction is that complacency grows across the left initially, but once the automation fails, we'll get a smaller problem for manual guidance and the largest failure for the auto control. And we're particularly interested in the difference between these two. All right, so in this graph down in the lower left, we show our measure of routine performance, all right? We had a measure of speed, a measure of accuracy, and these are our 3 degrees of automation: manual, situation support, full automation control. And I think the key thing is that in general, these move upwards. And in particular, there is greater speed and greater accuracy in the full auto control than SA-supported automation. And so we can look at the first part of our generic graph here and find this is manual performance. And these are things get better when with more degree of automation, when the automation is perfect. The higher tree, better. Now let's look at the failure performance. And what you ask is, how do we induce the automation failure? Well, we did it by simply specifying the coordinates of this second turn in the staple to not be here, but to lead them down into this trajectory, right? Lowering the Z value. If you lower the Z value and the arm follows it, it's going to collide or at least come very close to collision with the obstacle. And that's a huge problem when you've got a robotic arm in space and you collide with something. It's either can damage the arm, or if you have Sandra Bullock on the end, and remember that, you know, you can bring her smashed into the rocket. It's not a good thing. In the manual condition, we simply gave people the wrong coordinates for that. In the automation situation support with the orange line, we simply had the line that they were following lead close to the table. And in the auto control, the orange line is wrong, and the autopilot followed the wrong line. So our real question was, when we failed the automation on trial 7, how effectively could operators intervene? Yes?
Could they intervene in the auto control?
Yes, they could.
So they could.
And that was part of the instructions, you know, always, you know, you're auto controller, but you're always ready to take over if something goes wrong. Yeah. And as I had mentioned before, they had been trained manually, so they did have the manual skills to control the autopilot. Again, our prediction is now a prediction on the bottom line. And here's the observed failure response performance. So lower is worse. So it's a combination of speed and accuracy of noticing the automation failure. The key thing to notice is this slopes downward according to our prediction, and therefore across the 4 automation conditions, we have this divergence that we had predicted. Interestingly enough, the situation awareness support was no worse than full manual when the automation failed. And this is another sort of sidebar of the argument that I can make later, that oftentimes SA support automation is as good as full manual. You get the benefits without the costs. And so our conclusion from the experimental results, and I should say there's an awful lot more results. I'm just really presenting the broad picture so I can get through the other aspects of the talk. The higher degree of automation improves nominal performance. It degrades automation failure performance. The lower degree of automation offers benefits relative to manual performance with minimal cost. That's this flat line here. And this supports the value of stage 2 situation awareness or situation assessment support automation. And then the final point, this will lead me to the next couple of slides, is that we could do a computational model of the complacency effect to provide a fairly accurate prediction. There is a cost here, but how big that cost is going to be. And this is attributed to the monitoring failure that gets more and more hurtful, I guess you would say, at higher degrees of automation. So let me talk a little bit about the development of the complacency model in this particular context. Given the complacency is visual complacency, it's based on where you're looking in the workspace. We measured scanning of our operators while doing this task. We developed a computational model of complacency, which is a predictive model of how the operator scans the displays in the workspace. Given the bandwidth of each display, that is how rapidly things are changing in the different displays. Given the value of each display to the operator's overall task, sorry, that's my texting. Cracking in my pocket. And given the layout of the displays, so that indicates low bandwidth peripheral displays are rarely sampled, even if they are high value. I'll come back to that a little bit, but here's a simple heat path map of the visual scanning we had of the operators during a trial across the displays. And you can see how much of attention is grabbed by the photographic positions of the cameras, also by the overall view of the camera perspectives and so forth. We modeled the visual scanning performance by something called the Sieve model. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's our model of eye movements that divides the workplace into areas of interest. And the model predicts that the scanning looking to a particular area will be driven by 4 factors. The salience, so we look more often to large, flashing items. The effort to move between displays, so we're more likely to scan sequentially between 2 displays that are close together than between 2 that are far apart, is the effort of eye and head movements. The expectancy, we look more to a display where there's a lot of things happening, a high bandwidth, a lot of action. And finally, the value of the display to the task served by that particular display or area of interest. We'll look more at displays that serve our task than those that are less relevant to our tasks. Okay, so we can assign these parameters to each area of interest, or in the case of effort, to each pair of areas. And we can then predict the scanning to an area by simply adding up the salience minus the effort plus the expectancy plus the value. Okay. A lot of detail behind this. I'm more than happy to describe it later if anyone's interested. So our seed model predicts the delay in scanning the display where the automation error is evident. That is the part of the display that depicts the deviation between the programmed versus the actual trajectory. That is, this deviation between where X, Y, Z should be and where it actually is. And with a little task analysis, we identified these two areas provide the best camera views where that deviation should be emphasized, should be evident. And to the extent people are looking elsewhere, they will have a slower response in getting to it. So I've highlighted those in red as the areas of vulnerability to missing the automation failure. Well, since our seed model predicts the different bandwidth and values for the different displays, change with different degrees of automation, remember these are our three conditions, none, SA guidance, and auto control condition, it can predict different delays in noticing the automation failure and hence incurring a collision or penetration of the no-fly hazards zone. It's the table. And we looked at our results and we found that it indeed did so. We made these predictions a priori without seeing the detection data. And what I'm showing here are the predictions of our sea of complacency model, the observed frequency of hazard penetration colliding with the table. And what you can see is that our three condition points all lie sort of close to the line. And in particular, these 2 points, this is the manual and the SA support condition, are very close not only to each other, but also close to what our model predicted, that is close to the regression line. This is the prediction of the auto control condition, and it shows that actual performance was considerably worse than we predicted it to be in the model. We kind of tried to wrap our minds about why this might be, and the answer is that our model was based entirely on visual attention, where the eye is looking, and it's that the brain may not be focusing even though the eye is looking. And elsewhere I've talked about the difference between the mind ball and the brain ball, the eyeball and the mind ball. And so we think that people are doing worse because sometimes, even though they might be actually looking at the display, their mind was someplace else. We haven't yet figured out how to incorporate that in the seed model, but it's another area that I think our models of complacency. Okay, so the conclusion of experiment 1 is that we had support for the lumberjack. We confirmed the hypothesis for the 4 data points. We modeled complacency, but in this experiment, we did not explicitly provide a transparency to offset the later stage of automation. That is to fold that bottom curve upwards. And that's what we did in the next experiment. Different domain. The loss can be mitigated by transparency of the display, which depicts the raw data which automation is processing. And this is the goal of experiment 2, to test these hypotheses in the context of imperfect decision support in automation. So we're switching systems drastically from robotics arm control to air traffic control. And to do so, we're seeing if we can fold that lower line upwards. This is the dissertation work of Fitri Tapsawati at the Nanyang Technical Institute in Singapore. Was very interested in human automation interaction in air traffic control. And very briefly, an air traffic controller has got 2 primary responsibilities: productivity, delivering the planes on time to their destination, and safety, which is to avoid collisions. And if we unpack safety, at least at a simplified level, we can say that it's keeping any plane out of another plane's protected zone, or so-called hockey puck, okay, around the plane. And if it penetrates, another plane penetrates this, it's called a loss of separation, an LOS, which is puts a little red check mark next to a controller's performance rating. To avoid conflicts, there are really two stages: situation assessment, and that is conflict detection. Will the planes collide or lose separation? And if it does, then there's conflict resolution. How do you maneuver the plane to avoid or to get the plane out of the protected zone? And as you can see, these maps onto our two critical stages of automation. So we can define an increasing degree of automation. Situation assessment, the higher is decision aiding. On the left, there are lots of conflict detection aids out there actually working in the air traffic control system in live workstations. In terms of conflict resolution aids, they have not yet been implemented in the actual air traffic control consoles for a number of reasons. There have been researchers that have investigated the perfect conflict resolution aid, but there were not, as we were aware at this time, any that had looked at imperfect conflict resolution aids. And that was one of the things that Victory wanted to do in her dissertation. And then we had to figure, if we're going to implement an imperfect conflict resolution aid, how do we create that automation failure? What's the analogy in a CRA to the robotic arm program to the table? And I'll talk about that in a moment. But briefly, this was the typical air traffic control panel that she used. And it's typical of an air traffic controller's workstation. But it has an important human factors challenge that conflicts sometimes occur with vertical flight when one plane is climbing and the other is descending. And the imperfect conflict resolution aid that we used did serve to resolve vertical conflicts, sometimes with vertical maneuvers. So if I've got this guy climbing up, and I could say to this guy, well, turn level, that's a vertical maneuver to avoid the conflict. But the controller has no vertical display. That is, there's no transparency to the raw data about the vertical behavior of aircraft. So the controller, we would argue, has limited vertical situation awareness. We've identified an opportunity to intervene with a transparent display to help support situation awareness. It's something the controller does not have. This is a depiction of our designed VSD vertical situation awareness display. I'll not describe the details of this picture, but simply show you a more schematic view of it, in which an operator can see the track of two aircraft over the ground, can see the relative altitude of the two, and can make an inference that without this maneuver, these two are going to collide. Right. I've got to turn this thing off. The duck is very distracting. The duck was supposed to be distracting. Sound down. And so we designed a VSD to provide this sort of transparency. The second challenge is, how do we make the air traffic and the conflict resolution advisor imperfect? Well, our CRA worked with an auditory display that would basically take a plane, look at this situation, and then advise the controller to climb the aircraft. The controller could accept or reject the advice if they choose, so it wasn't the highest level of decision advice. And our aid was always reliable in recommending a vertical maneuver, but the automation made it fail on occasion in the following way. Sometimes when it would advise a climb, it would avoid what we call primary conflict, but it would now put the plane on trajectory with a secondary aircraft up above. And the controller, I'm sorry, our automation did not detect the secondary conflict. So what I'm going to talk to you today is the collective data from two of her experiments. I'm lumping them together. One has been published, the other is in press right now, or in submission right now. But altogether, we had 48 air traffic control trained participants. Each participant had 4 different blocks. Each block had 6 different conflicts that required them to actively maneuver to separate the aircraft. One of them was a manual block, which had no conflict resolution aid. There were 2 blocks that had an imperfect CRA, which was 83% reliable. So there's 6 conflicts. One of those conflicts, the CRA directed the plane into a secondary. And notice that by having 2 blocks, you could look at the first block and identify the first failure response. That's important. We also had 1 block of perfect CRA automation. And although there were several things we measured in here, the important ones for the purposes today was the percentage success in avoiding a conflict, that is, avoiding a situation where one plane penetrated the hazard zone of the other, and measures of situation awareness. This is the so-called SAGAT technique used by Micah Ensley. I think many of you are familiar with that. And it's simply randomly asking controllers to answer some question about the vertical of the situation on the air traffic. Which 2 planes are coming together? Is this plane climbing or descending, and so forth? Okay, I guess this is just repeating what I said before about our 2 measures that I'm going to talk about today: performance and the secondary measure, which was situation awareness. So what did we find? Okay, this is kind of a representation. On the y-axis is our measure of performance, that is the percentage of successfully resolved conflicts. And here is the manual condition. I've left this blank space blank because we did not have a SA support automation in this experiment. That is, we didn't have that lower degree of automation in this experiment. All we did was the decision aiding automation over here. And so this is the performance with decision aiding automation when automation was 83% reliable, and on the blocks where it was 100%. What I want to point out to you, however, is that across all trials, performance was good on the first time automation failed. Their percentage detection declined drastically. That's the first failure effect that we see over and over again. The first time things happen for an operator, you had a relatively large drop in performance. They went from resolving about 94% of the conflicts down to about 70%, and that's a significant drop. Some of you may look at the upper points in green and say, well, if the automation was 100% reliable, why wasn't their performance 100% reliable? And it's simply because not all the controllers accepted the guidance at the time. I talked about that a little bit with Matt's group earlier. Sometimes, even though you know it's grid, you'll reject its advice. We had 2 groups of controllers. One always had access to that vertical situation awareness display, transparency. The other group never had access to it. This is the data points you saw before for the group without the VSD, but for the group that had the VSD, performance got a little bit bad on the first failure, but not terribly bad. In fact, that drop was not significant at the magic holy 0.05 level. And so our finding was the first failure cost was mitigated for the controllers who had the transparency VSD. The last piece of the equation was why did the VSD help? And here we looked at our situation awareness measures. So now on the y-axis is the measure of SAGAT, the percentage correct in answering these questions about the airspace. And what we found here, this is SA for the group without the vertical situation awareness display. This is situation awareness for the group that had transparency. So transparency increases situation awareness, and transparency also increases or mitigates that first failure cost. Can we be sure that there is a causal relationship between increasing situation awareness and increasing failure performance? No, we can't be sure, but it's another set of data points that suggest there is some causal effect there. Okay, so the general conclusions we have from these two experiments now. Experiment 1, that is with the robotics arm automation failure.
First failure effect.
You're responsible. Okay, read fast.
I have no idea.
Is the back screen doing the same thing?
Yeah.
Fortunately, it is my last slide, so. Anyway, experiment 1, the lumberjack analogy holds from low to high degree of automation. But in that first experiment, we did not examine transparency. We did model automation-induced complacency, and I think we did so with reasonable success. In experiment 2, the higher degree of automation offered by this decision support produced large benefits of automation over manual control. It produced large first failure costs, and but it also, there was a large reduction in these costs with the VSD display that created transparency, which also increased situation awareness. Notice in the second experiment, we did not examine stage 2 automation within that design, and I think that full experiment remains to be done. But we do believe that we can do the full experiment sort of with all 6 conditions that show reduce the fall of the higher tree, soften the fall of the bigger tree. And if we can, then we can maybe get as many benefits out of the higher degree of automation without producing the costs. But in the meantime, I think we still, or at least for a number of reasons, I still favor the automation for situation awareness support more so than automation as decision aiding. There's a lot of reasons behind that that I'd be happy to chat with people and so forth. Okay, so that ends the talk. Applications. Oh, I've given this to aero engineering and a space engineering group. So these are some emails that you can get in touch with me, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thanks, Chris.
And I know I glossed over a lot of details about this. If you followed closely, I'm sure you've got some questions. I didn't do that.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions. Rick?
Oh, yeah. So did you look at the cost of your visual support display? I mean,
Oh, in terms of added workload?
right. Yeah.
No, we didn't, but that's a really important issue that we have to consider, because if it's going to support task or something that doesn't happen very often and be a workload sink for other tasks. And that's why I think there's a lot of good research that needs to go into the economic, what does it mean to present? Because transparency is not just presenting more data, it's presenting the necessary data in an easy to integrate form. Yeah. Great.
So I love your talk. I guess I have a lot of questions, but right now my favorite question is about how to connect the mind wandering and the visual perception. And so you have this thing that's going on where you have complacency that's going on. And as far as I can tell, you have this the very first important, the first failure. That's where you get the biggest bump.
Yeah.
But of course, what happens is that, my guess is that, and we see this in our data, is you get complacency and then something happens, and then complacency and then something happens. And
Less complacency.
less complaint. Yeah, it depends on how you flip it. But, and so the question is, how do you actually connect and understand and model those things, particularly when you tie it into the eye movement work that you're talking about and the mental work that you talk about?
I don't know. I mean, that's clearly that's where a lot of the EEG measurement is going to help us understand the complacency of the mind ball rather than the eyeball. We know it takes place, and in this particular situation, we had people in the auto control condition saying, gee, I didn't really have much to do. They did have things to do. They had to continually adjust the cameras. They had to continually adjust the speed. But, they said, literally, my mind was wandering sometimes. Yeah. And that's what, of course, accounted for that, right, of the cost. So, I mean, I'd love to get at that through physiological measures. The trouble is they can have a harder time designating. The eyeball is so special to be able to look. Okay. Your question is the same as mine. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had given any thought to how uncertainty plays into this, mainly because I noticed that in your training for individuals on the ARM task, they trained on a system that was 100% accurate, yet they were then exposed to a system that wasn't.
Yeah.
Do you think you would be able to reduce the sort of cost of first failure if you trained individuals on imperfect systems?
Again, a really interesting question. We wrestle with that so much in our design of instructions for how do you induce a mindset in the participant that something could go wrong without getting them prepared all the time. And I'm not sure what the issue is or what the answer is. We do, in the aviation world, we tell the pilots, you're always responsible for the safety of the aircraft, no matter what happens. And that's a mindset that's, okay to give to a pilot. I don't know how effective it is, in the untrained participants. But it's important to train them in the manual condition as we did, and tell them that they're, this is one of the things they're always responsible, is making sure the arm doesn't, collide with the table.
Time for one more.